during the launch of NGO-PLA, and has acted as ADM's R&D lead for the TELUS JV in commercializing PHA. He has numerous accolades and has 2 patents in his name. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to present this. I want to make it controversial. So in the spirit of being controversial, this talk hopefully will offend a few people, hopefully not too many, but will create some good opportunity for discussion. I want to talk about petrochemical industry context because I spent most of my career at the Dow Chemical Company, and I learned a little bit about the petrochemical industry. Talk about what's going on with bio-based chemicals, and I've got a bigger talk that's a whole lot more broader in terms of who's doing what and that kind of thing. So I'm only going to do a brief overview of some of the what I consider more important commercial activities here. I want to talk about a few case studies because the conclusions and forecasts really are dependent on a couple of case studies. So why are people interested in this whole area of chemicals rather than fuels? This slide shows that, this is U.S. petrochemical consumption in 2005. It shows that 3/4 of the petroleum used in the United States is used in this whole area of motor vehicle transport fuels and other non-transportation energy products, somewhere between 3 and 7%. I've seen numbers at 3% and 7%, somewhere around there, goes into chemical products. And if you look at the value that's created in these 3 sectors, you can see there's nearly equal value for these two, even though only 7% goes into the chemical world. So there's a lot more value in chemicals than there is in just burning things for fuels. And then if you look at petrochemical business trends, last year this slide was totally different. Things have changed so dramatically in the last year that it's really changed the whole context for what we're doing. As we've heard, there's abundant U.S. natural gas. By the way, last year's talk talked about how Dow Chemical's feedstock costs rose in 2005, I think it was, by $5 billion. Their feedstock and energy costs for a $50 billion company. I mean, it had happened year after year in the early 2000s. So, the chemical industry was just really being strangled by petroleum costs. Today, we have abundant natural gas. All the manufacturing was going off to Middle East and China and places that were cheaper to build and so forth, and raw materials were cheaper. Today, CNN News is talking about, quoting Dow and other big chemical companies, saying that they plan to grow their manufacturing in the United States by 40% in the next 20 years. I mean, just enormous change in the last year or two. The other point that I haven't heard many people talk, or anybody talk about, is it's not only natural gas, but it's light crude from horizontal drilling technology. We're supposed to be, the U.S. is supposed to be a net oil exporter in the next 5 years. So again, the context here has changed dramatically. So what does that mean for us? Well, we're not running out of oil and gas, at least not in the next couple of decades. And really, for us who are trying to build businesses in this area, that's forever, because we need to make money in the next few years. So we've got to be careful about this. We need to be aware of what that's going to do to oil prices. And my soapbox for the last 10 years is that bio-based chemicals really don't get a lot for being bio-based. We have to really build our businesses on cost performance drivers. That is key. Okay, so that's the bad news. The good news is there is a lot of increased demand from consumers. You've heard a whole lot about that, so I won't talk about it, but that's the good news. There are significant drivers in our favor. So this slide is an interesting one to me. Um, Everything we're doing today, we think is new. It really isn't new. A lot of this stuff has been done for 100 years. So prior to World War II, butanol was made by acetone butanol ethanol fermentation, or ABE fermentation. All this furanic stuff that Avantium's doing, they're doing it wonderfully, let me just say. I think it's really wonderful chemistry. But it's been done, the furfural and furan, tetrahydrofuran was done by Quaker Oats almost 100 years ago, extracting from corn cobs. Hydrogenolysis chemistry here has been done since the 30s and done well. Conversions of glycerol to acrolein, which is a precursor of acrylic acid, was done in the 1880s. So, and then ethanol dehydration, which is really simple and really easy to do and really economical, has been done for a lot of years likewise. And then we've seen a lot about this slide, that the bio-based polymers business is still really small. It's less than 1% of the plastics business. And this next generation of polymers like PLA and PHA, polyhydroxyalkanoates, and glycerin-based materials, soy polyol for urethanes, represents 3% of that 1%. So most of it is natural rubber and cellulosics. So it's a small but highly growing sector, fast-growing sector. And this is for all you people who are chemists, all 1 or 2 or 3 of you in the audience, so I apologize. But what I've tried to do over the last 5 or 6 years is put together a list of molecules that people are making bio-based, and using these in our thinking in terms of how we build materials off them. So the succinic acids, adipic acids, fumaric acids, citric, and on and on and on. The alcohols that you can dehydrate to ethylene, propylene, butadiene, and so forth, farnesene, the PHAs, the lactic acid, 3-hydroxypropionic acid that dehydrates readily to acrylic acid, and on and on. So, and the next slide shows those that you can get from chemical transformations, and a lot of this stuff is going on, taking the sugars and using them for fermentation, substrates of course, but they can be dehydrated to isosorbide, to these furanics, which again, I think furanic chemistry is really a great platform to create from levulinic acid and ethylene glycol, propylene glycol, acrylic acid, glycerol, and the aromatics. So then this part of the talk I'm going to skip through really quick. I just want to do a brief overview of who's doing what in this bio-based space. And for example, we all know about Braskem and biopolyethylene. This is slowed a bit because it can't quite compete with petro-based ethylene, and you'd hope to get some kind of a bio-premium, but bio-premiums are small in this business. But it's moving along, and congratulate Braskem for their efforts. GIVO and Butamax, of course, are looking at butanol fermentation. Started out as an N-butanol fermentation. N-butanol has got big advantages in terms of being able to pipeline it, and energy value, energy content relative to ethanol and so forth. Became an isobutanol play because they get higher titers, and it's a better fermentation, less costly fermentation. GIVO is also got a patent to convert isobutylene to paraxylene, which is a molecule I think I'm going to talk about in a bit. And then glycerol. You know, a couple of years ago, everybody thought glycerol was going to be really cheap and really abundant because it's an inexpensive byproduct from biodiesel. And so working for ADM's a big biodiesel producer and is building capacity around glycerol. But this slide shows that glycerol is available at 2 billion pounds a year from biodiesel. And by the way, 1.8 billion pounds of that's already spoken for in terms of USP glycerol and other types of glycerol uses. And then everybody has been announcing capacity to dehydrate to acrylic acid, to produce epichlorohydrin, propane-diol, propylene, 1,3 and 1,2 propane-diol. And you can see from 2 billion pounds, you can't make 9, 10, 11. I mean, there's just, all the capacity for glycerol is spoken for, and then some. And so basically the price of glycerol has become very volatile as a result. So glycerol is no longer the cheap feedstock that we thought it was a few years ago. Bioisoprene is another one that people are talking a lot about, and you've heard some of that today. The Furanics platform, our friends from Avantium have done a nice job describing that. Furfural, get from dehydration of C5 of pentose sugars, xylose in particular, fructose, glucose, other name dextrose. Sugar chemistry is really complicated in terms of its nomenclature, but anyway, it dehydrates to hydroxymethylfurfural, and yeah, Avantium did a great job describing their chemistry, and it's really neat stuff. Others are looking at this kind of chemistry in the United States as well. Domestic in particular, Wisconsin, Maskell at Davis, UC Davis. So using strong acids to dehydrate hexose sugars to HMF in Domestic's case, and CMF, chloromethylfurfural, in Maskell's case. So building lots of interesting materials, including paraxylene from hydroxymethylfurfural, which can be converted to terephthalic acid. Paraxylene is the petrochemical precursor for paraxylene. So there are lots of players in this business. Some getting it from biomass pyrolysis or thermochemical conversions. Others from Diels-Alder of furanics. Furanate carboxylic acid and so forth. And then this isobutanol and paraxylene that GEVO is doing. And I don't have time to talk about the chemistries. If you want to know more about the chemistries, I'd be glad to talk to you. And then we've heard about this consortium that's encouraging this kind of research. We're working at MMI. Ryan Smith from Micromidas was supposed to give this talk, and he graciously encouraged me to. But Micromidas is doing basically converting lots of different cellulosic feedstocks to paraxylene with similar kinds of processes. And unfortunately, I can't talk a lot about it. But the one point I wanted to stop and make here is that with cellulosic feedstocks, the alternative is to pre-treat with strong acid or strong base to break up the structure, break up the cellulose, and make it accessible so that you can saccharify it to sugars and then ferment it. This process does that pre-treatment process and directly gives you furanics. So it's a big advantage in terms of cost. You're doing one process, the pre-treatment process, to give you the product instead of the pre-treatment and then the fermentation. So there are economic advantages to doing it this way. And then their technology, like I say, gives you directly paraxylene without mixed isomers. It shows the stuff crystallizes out at 10 degrees or whatever, just subambient temperatures, and gives you a really nice, pure product. Bioacrylic acid is another one that's got a lot of attention. So this is a petrochemical route from propylene through acrolein. There are two primary bio routes and maybe a third. This 3HP dehydration, 3-hydroxypropionic acid dehydrates when you heat it up to try and strip off water from the fermentation broth. It readily dehydrates to acrylic acid. But you've got to do a lot of bioengineering to get there, and so it's still not commercial. You can catalytically dehydrate glycerol, and Arkham has spent a lot of time and energy on this one, and have got some pretty good patent technology. And the third point to make is that 2HP is lactic acid. 3HP, this one readily dehydrates to acrylic. This one doesn't. But there are a lot of people working on actually dehydrating lactic acid to acrylic acid as well. And the big market, obviously, is superabsorbent polymers, polyacrylic acid superabsorbents. And then this is the glycerol chemistry. Dehydrate to acrolein and then oxidize it or add water to it to acrylic acid. And again, these companies active in that area. Lactic acid, we heard a lot about PLA yesterday, but I want to tell a story about PLA. So one slide about the chemistry, going from starch or sugars fermented to lactic acid, dimerized, and then polymerized with a ring opening polymerization. And by the way, Romney and Ryan and students wrote the Bible on that chemistry. DuPont Sorona is another one that's made a splash in the marketplace. 1,3-propane-diol making polypropylene terephthalate. My whole house is carpeted with Sorona, and I agree it's wonderful stuff. And likewise, you've heard from Rickino, PHA chemistry. This is the fat of bacteria, right? So bacteria use PHA as an energy source. They polymerize it up to 2-3 million molecular weight within the cell. And polyesters don't get to that high molecular weight chemically. Nature does it much better than we can. And then these granules are extracted, usually with a solvent, and purified. And it's a very interesting material. So this slide, metabolics, I worked for ADM during this process, and it breaks your heart to see this kind of stuff because these polymers are really interesting polymers. But anyway, the launch didn't go so well, and hopefully metabolics will do better in the future. But this leads me into really what I wanted, the point I want to leave with you in this talk. And that is, how do you bring materials, new polymers, new materials to the market? And there are three ways to do it, in my opinion. You can do exact replacements, like bio-polyethylene. The only thing you compete on is cost and quality. So it's pretty simple. You just need to meet these metrics, and it works. And the biosource is a tiebreaker, but again, it doesn't give you a lot of value in the marketplace. Maybe in niche applications it might, but fundamentally, you don't get a lot of value for being renewable or biodegradable. You can be equivalent in an application, and DuPont Sorona, I think, is a good example there. DuPont realized that this was a really good fiber material, and so they basically brought it to commercialization, and I think they've had pretty good success with it because they know it really works as a carpet fiber and other types of polyester applications. And then the third one is this one that is a brand new to the world kind of material. And let me say, this is the hardest by far. This is a really hard proposition. And it's not so much the science, it's not the technology, it's not building the plants and engineering really good processes to make this stuff. That's the easy part compared to trying to figure out a market. If you don't have any idea what market you're trying to sell into, that by far and away is the hardest part. And the reason for that, I've brought myself a list of reasons. And let me just say, nobody does it well. If you're teaming up with a big company because you think they understand how to introduce new materials to the market, let me just say, good luck, because nobody does that well. So we heard yesterday from the NatureWorks guys, from Mark Verbergen, how do you brand it? Do you brand it as a commodity or as a specialty? How do you price it? Because commodities attract very different pricing structures than specialties do. How do you predict what the market's going to do? PLA was introduced into a recession, a small recession. PHA was introduced in 2010 into a giant recession. How do you predict that? Usually people build capacity when market's good, and then when it comes time to launch it, you very often hit difficult market times, and that's what happened with both of these. Once you're in a market, you better darn well understand it well, because if you don't, the competition, the incumbents will eat you alive. So you need to become expert in the markets you're trying to sell into. And that by far and away is the most difficult thing to do. So here's my case for renewable incumbents, is the marketing, already talked about. Downstream conversion technology for an incumbent material is already well known, like, for example, paraxylene going to terephthalic acid going to PET. That's already well understood. It fits into the integrated manufacturing structure, and integration is king. That's how you bring costs down, using water across the whole plant, using electricity and on and on, and heat and so forth. So integration is key, using byproducts throughout the plant. It fits business infrastructure, and again, these business guys, sorry to offend people, but you need a business person who really understands technology and science and can really envision what these materials might be used for. And then finally, the metrics for success are easy for an incumbent material. It competes only on quality and cost. So, case studies, a couple of quick ones. And I know I'm going to offend people here, but Cargill and Dow invested, the two plants cost, almost $750 million. And I think the investment was well above $1 billion, close to a couple billion bucks. The point here is, it takes money to do this. It takes huge resources to introduce new materials. Dow invested in 2005 because of negative cash flow. NatureWorks, they are, I'm sure, cash flow positive now, but it's a $2 billion hole they invested. It's going to be a while till they recoup that. And God bless them, Cargill had the resources to stick with it, and so they have stuck with it, and now they've got a successful product. Dow didn't have the guts to do that. Cargill did. And now they are successful, but that's a big hole. And likewise, PHAs have struggled, and I think it's not that it's a bad material, it's how do you define the market space, right? And so that's that, and I'm done. One more slide. Case studies, these are successful. They're incumbents, and many of them. Glycerol successful, ethylene's moving along, propylene glycol and 1,3-propane diol are moving along because that's the only metric. And so challenges, I've talked about this, and then last slide here for sure. The emerging trends are that look for, just like the petrochemical world came out of cheap fuels, I think a lot of stuff that we do likewise will be associated with biofuels development. Prospects for commercializing new materials are tough. Renewable incumbents really is the way to go. So that's all I have. Happy to answer questions and apologize for going over.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. So we have a microphone in the back of the auditorium here. So when you're asking your questions, if you could please use the microphone, that'd be great. And we have a couple minutes for questions.
When you're talking about the different carbohydrate chemistries that people are working on and developing for some of these polymer manufacturing processes, you discussed two basic ways of going about that. Basically chemistry processes and reaction vessels versus bioengineering and microorganisms to do the work for you with enzymes. What do you see out of those two processes as being the most advantageous to the future growth of the marketplace with the cost versus the time invested in research and development?
Yeah, that's a good question and a difficult question. I said my remarks really were around cellulosic feedstocks because to get the fermentation sugars, you have to pre-treat them anyway, and so it's capital intensive and costly. You can do it, I think, cheaper, much cheaper with cellulosic feedstocks chemically than you can do it from fermentation. And that's true in most cases, that's not true in all cases. But it depends on what kind of markets you're looking for. If you're looking for commodities, then my statements are true. If you're looking for specialties, so high-value specialties, then you can look at a lot of different routes. And I guess I would really encourage, there's probably another take-home, is looking to make a big impact in the commodity space maybe isn't wise either as you commercialize materials. So look for opportunities in higher value specialties. Look in the pharmaceutical world, in the ag world. Looking in bioplastics, unless you have really expensive economics, you probably should look elsewhere.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Smith. So next we have Dr. Molly Morse.